I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the earth's sweet flowing breast, a tree that looks at God all day and lifts her leafy arms to pray, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair, upon whose bosom snow has lain, who intimately lives with rain. Poems are made by fools like me.
But I'm not lovely as a tree.
But only God can make a tree.
Oh, yes. Oh, Aaron. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Solacene. Aaron and I have a poem of the week here in our household, and this week he decided to just steal it.
Yeah. So all credits go to Joyce Kilmer, who wrote that poem in 1914. And maybe you could tell that it wasn't mine by Alicia's laughter and the overt references to God. But I still think it's nice. It's a nice kind of, it fits our semester. It fits the nature semester. And then I was thinking, along the lines of our poem of the week that we have in the household, what is some analysis of that poem? What's it really trying to say? What do you think?
It's trying to say anything man-made will not equate to the beauty of nature. And we can try. We can put together nice words. We can put together nice paintings. But at the end of the day, the intricate beauty on a biological level and an aesthetic level of a tree, for example, will never equate to the beauty of a poem about a tree.
I was even thinking not just the beauty, but the cohesion, the oneness that a tree has. Because obviously the poem starts by saying, I'll never see a poem as lovely as a tree. But then it goes on to say about how intimately the tree lives with rain and birds and things. As if our things, even if you make a completely pastoral or like nature-y poem or painting, just because it's from your hand, kind of to an extent, it will always be reflecting humanity a little bit. Like there'll always be a bit of a separation.
Yeah.
Anyway, today we're talking about living in that separation or something. We're talking about community design today, especially leaning towards the nature aspects of it, because I suspect we will have a more architecture and community designed themed semester in the future. So we don't want to overstep on that. But it's an important part of nature is how we incorporate it into our own domiciles and dwellings. And we talked before about houseplants. So I think this is kind of an extension of that discussion, city plants or town plants.
Exactly. And also talking a little bit about how human settlements can try to be a bit more one with nature instead of it being like, okay, this is where the buildings are, this is where the nature is, how to intertwine them a bit better. And in our zine, we talk about this a bit on the first page. So if you're interested, you can purchase our zine through the link in our description. All the proceeds go towards eco-justice. They're handmade, hand-designed, handwritten.
Very funny, very informative, very inspiring. And you'll make a new friend because there's a guy featured in it who I just love. So.
And you can also subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen, leave a comment or a like, and we're on YouTube as well.
So our first question is about the nature of urban living and how it is perhaps inherently contradictory or opposed to that of nature. And I kind of started this by trying to find the definition for urban or urbanism. And it was frustratingly difficult because every definition online just refers back to like of or relating to a city, obviously. And then when you look at definitions of cities, it's 100% variable by country, by region. And it's just like everybody has their own definition. So I thought to an extent we could try and define it a little bit in terms of its relationship to nature versus rural living.
Yeah, I think for the purpose of today's episode, it'll be anything other than very rural that we're talking about, because even rural by this internet definition is still a grouping of homes. There's a school, there's a hospital, there's a few grocery stores. So I think in my mind, city or urban living would be any kind of sprawled settlement of people connected by concrete roads would probably be a big part of it.
They have to be concrete?
Yeah, because if it's dirt
What
roads,
about
I feel like it's a
cobblestone?
bit less. Oh, you know what I mean.
I think, there's
Paved.
obviously the markers of like population, population density.
Yeah.
But I just also think that like by its definition, it has less nature than rural. Like that's a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
It's probably like 1/3 of the parts of it. So that's kind of what I was thinking for this question. So my easy answer is like, yeah, they're like by definition kind of incompatible.
I was reading, and even the biggest cities still have about 1/6 of the land mass covered by trees and green space and things like that. Not necessarily the most biodiverse. So therefore it's 5-6% concrete buildings. People.
Yeah. I was trying to extend that definition a little bit in terms of like describing the nature that then is present in cities. Because I think another kind of fundamental way of putting it is that when urban places, when they exist, nature kind of bends to them. Mm-hmm. Whereas when rural places exist, roughly speaking, the human buildings kind of and human infrastructure kind of bend to the nature. That was just a rough way of putting it. So I was thinking that like, however green a city is, like we live in Montreal, which is a rather green city. Like there's parks all over the place, there's trees, there's a lot of little farms like you volunteer at. Every kind of element of nature is controlled, like by definition. There's no wilderness present, which there can be in rural living. That was kind of my way of distinguishing those two.
Yeah, I think presence of wilderness is a great indicator. And I think the presence of wild areas is a great place to start for this conversation about designing the Solacene version of this, the Solacene city, and how it will incorporate nature. I think it will be a lot more wild areas, but you can't just throw a wild space into a city without the people knowing about what it is and also how to take care of it. It's been attempted across the world by urban ecologists who are like, the best way to promote biodiversity would be to leave a plot of land completely wild, plant all native species, perhaps even introduce some native insects and so on to it. But it's like, if the people don't like that, like a lot of people still have a very Arcadian, romantic view of nature, and they think it should be very like a painting, basically. A stretch of grass, a few cool plants. But even in that aesthetic vision and aesthetic ideal, the species that you envision in it are not necessarily native to your region. So if you then throw in just a place with a bunch of scraggly grass and stuff that would perhaps normally grow in North America, people would be like, ew, this just looks like someone...
So people wouldn't want it, in other words.
Yeah, and therefore they might disrespect it, and if they saw someone else disrespecting it, they wouldn't reprimand them the way that if it was some kind of beautiful, super fancy, landscaped place.
Like a park.
Yeah. I think another thing about urban ecology is often it will serve the needs of the people before it serves the needs of the nature. Obviously, it's like, okay, we need to reinforce this area so that we don't get floods. And so that's what the urban ecologists would focus on when city planning would be just trying to find the best way to mitigate floods through nature. Mm-hmm. But it's like, okay, maybe the best way isn't actually the most natural way.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying with finding a balance of control and wild. But I think, like, as I was saying, cities are 100% controlled. Mm-hmm. I think that just shows that that's what people want. Yeah. Like, even when you look at, let's say, solar punk visions of green cities of the future, they are very kind of architectural, rendered, trees lining a street. Maybe it's walkable, maybe it isn't. A big, nicely trimmed park with a lot of trees, maybe a pond, some farms, like I was saying. But it's all very prim. Mm-hmm. It's all very controlled. And I just think, for the most part, that's what people living in a city want. Because you don't want to be like walking down the street and be like, oh no, there's a coyote.
Yeah.
That's for people living in like Timbuktu.
No, but I read a lot about urban wildlife and how the idea of them as vermin or dangerous is mainly linked to our perception and our lack of smarts, I suppose. Like, a coyote isn't going to just attack you if you're walking by it, and it's not going to just like come out of the woods and get you. But it's like, if you saw that, you'd be terrified, and therefore everyone would try and hunt down the coyotes that there's not in the urban area, speaking from personal experience. But it's like, if perhaps we were like, okay, this is where the coyotes live, we'll have to change our routines a bit. I think that's kind of the Solacene way. There'll be more urban mammals, not like I think coyote is probably a bad example, but I think there could still be a lot more like deer roaming. Things that aren't necessarily aggressive, but they also mean that you have to sometimes stop your bike to let them pass. Whereas we might be annoyed today if that happened, or even scared.
Okay, so you're envisioning people going on their way to school and work, maybe petting a deer on the way?
Yeah, exactly.
Or like singing to some birds in some Disney sense, right?
Of course.
Okay. I think that's where we might differ a little bit in the definition of city, you and I mean, for the Solacene. So I guess listeners, they can just choose your path. It's like a choose your own adventure. Because as I was saying, I think cities mainly attract people who want a lot of control. That's the only way I can put it. Like the key is kind of in the term planning. It's like things are very planned out in terms of the presence of nature, which I don't think really is nature in a city. I think it's more like a facsimile of it. And you think, and I think that there are those cities, and then outside of that in the Solacene is just almost all wilderness and train tracks and some rural settlements.
Yeah.
But you think that the Solacene city incorporates itself a lot more of that wilderness.
Yeah, I think it'll be more 50-50 of the space that is wilderness and the space that is developed, because I think this would allow a bit more ecological authenticity. So like within the developed areas, there'd be parks, as you're describing, just like normal open spaces, because you have to control them. And as people are kind of becoming woke to the fact that nature's the best medicine, for lack of better words, like it's called the green prescription. Like doctors like just go outside, it'll help with your mental health, lower cortisol and so on. The green spaces, they used to perhaps be even within cities a bit more wild. Like I'm literally looking at Mont Royal, which is a big park, which is a nature reserve. It's completely designed and like there's no actual wildlife roaming in this huge green space, but it perhaps used to be. But because there's so many people using it, it needs to be more user friendly. But I think if there were more green belts kind of through cities or green corridors for animals to just live in, they might kind of leak into the cities a bit more. But if that's the case, we'd have to respect them and not be like, deer, we need to kill it, or we need to like shove it back into the nature. We'd be like, the deer, it's walking through here. I just think the biodiversity within literal cities needs to go up probably like 30% would be what I would think is cool. Because right now in Montreal, for example, we have squirrels, pigeons, a couple seagulls, and maybe rats.
You're forgetting something.
What else?
Little quadruped, hairy, very low to the ground.
Chiens.
No.
Oh, marmots.
Yeah, marmots.
Yeah, there are marmots here. But like there's not that many mammals.
No, I know what you mean.
But I think if it went up just a smidge, maybe the bird population was a bit more diverse and so on, I think it'd be good for the people, because all research into the benefits of nature on people's mental health and physical health is just like, it could literally just be a patch of grass. And it's going to have a pretty similar impact on the people's health. Therefore, because people are like a bit more into control and into like understanding what's there, there's no need for the people to have these areas be biodiverse. Like they're not going to care if there's 80% more biodiversity in the soil or whatever. Isn't going to impact the people. But I think it's a slightly dangerous way of thinking in the long term, because then we could just be like, well, we don't actually need these species for us.
Yeah.
But it's like it's good for the species and for the soil and for the survival of the plants.
I think they're both pleasant visions. I would like to live in both places.
Yeah, they're both pretty great.
I just envision it being more that people leave the city to go camping and such. There's a lot of wilder spaces outside the city.
Yeah.
But I think perhaps what we both agree on is that it's relatively easy to make the existing kind of template of cities green.
Yeah,
like,
I think so.
When people say that, they just mean visually green. They're like, oh, there's a lot of greenery. This is a green city, which is true. But I think about ways of making urban living feel more like you're in nature, even if, in my opinion, it is still very controlled. Because current cities, like take Montreal, they feel very geometric. Because they are very geometric, however many trees are on there. And that's kind of an unnatural way of walking or being. When we were walking around, or maybe I should say newer cities, because when we were walking around like Rome or London or Paris, they're so winding and so unplanned. And that gives me more of a natural feeling of discovery, let me put it like that. And there's also the fact that, like, there's other elements, like the width of the roads. Like, when you're kind of funneled down very narrow streets, that doesn't feel very naturey, because kind of intrinsic to nature, natural spaces in my mind is that there's a lot of open space, and you don't feel so constrained.
Yeah.
Like, there should be a big difference between being indoors and being outdoors, maybe. Another thing is, like, your view. In nature, it's often unobstructed for a long ways. Whereas in cities, especially ones that I think are kind of built with a skyline in view, rather than built for the experience of the people walking around it, there is no kind of gradual elevation like there would be on, say, a mountain range or on a plain. It's just kind of these jutting buildings at random almost, which is, it kind of disrupts your view, and it's just an ugly feeling sometimes.
Okay, so you're thinking like the literal architecture and the city planning is a bit more leaning into biomimicry.
Yes.
Okay,
I was
think
thinking
that's
about ways
wonderful.
to do that, yeah.
Yeah, because I suppose in the Solacene, there wouldn't be a way to literally just have wilderness sprinkled through, because that would just be impractical.
Well, I do think parks should have more species. That's what I'm saying. I just think that, like, that is the divide between rural and urban, is where the deer roam to an extent. But if you disagree, like, that's fine.
Yeah.
And listeners, I'm sure it's like, if someone wants to live in, like, Snow White City, then I just think that would just be called Snow White Town.
Yeah, I guess it is a bit more town. It's called a city town in urban planning, kind of my vision for all the Solacene cities, and that it's almost intentionally obtuse. Like, in a city, everything's about as efficient as possible.
Yes.
And I think to an extent that's good for sustainability and for making the most out of life.
Well, that's straight lines in the streets. That is uber efficient, right?
Yeah. But it's like maybe just some planned winding roads, kind of like Venice or something. It's like, it's going to just take you half an hour to get one block over.
Because, like, to get kind of historical with it, the way that those cities were formed, i.e. not really planned, or if they were planned, like we're talking about the old European cities, or if they were planned, they were planned by multiple different people over different centuries, and each plan kind of stepped over the other one and knocked over buildings and stuff and replanned. That is more akin to the process of, like, a forest forming in nature, as in there was no plan. I'm not talking from, like, a spiritual sense, but there was no, like, there's not much order to it. They just kind of springs up where is necessary and where is efficient, and there's kind of a beautiful, like, logic to it, but also, like, a really wonderful, you get lost very easily. And I think there are some cities that have that, capture that essence well, and there are some where it's like, this feels like I'm walking on a ruler or on a sheet of graph paper.
Yeah, I mean, post-industrialization, it was just like, well, we have double the amount of people. It's most efficient to just build these highly planned grid cities and suburbs and so on. Yeah, I see what you mean. A few cities that I'd like to highlight for their biodiversity would be Mexico City. Within its borders, it contains 2% of the total world's biodiversity.
What?
Yeah.
And all the dogs.
Not the dogs.
I think they have a lot of dogs.
And the world's most biodiverse city is Cape Town, mainly because of its very variable habitat within the city.
It's true. They have mountains,
ocean, all of this jazz. But they also do a lot to maintain that biodiversity. And then finally, a species I would like to highlight is, I was trying to find the most wonky by our standards, because we have like, everything looks the same. Pigeon, rat, squirrel. It's like, they're
I don't know what that means, but okay.
I was trying to find the coolest animal that lives within a city.
Okay.
And is kind of like their version of a pest to an extent. And my choice was the marmoset. Do you see him? Or her?
Looks splendid. Kind of looks like something from Madagascar.
Yeah.
Was it?
I don't think those are marmosets.
Okay.
Marmosets are from South America. Mainly, they're lemurs from Madagascar. It looks like a lemur. They look very simple. Like, their body is just kind of one thing. It doesn't look like it has joints or anything. Has a tail, and they can have those little wingy hair things. That's what I drew there.
I thought you just stylized it like Picasso. But you're saying that's actually how flat they are.
They're very one-dimensional, and their color isn't super different on a lot of them. Pygmy marmosets are the most famous because they're, like, tiny. They, like, fit on your finger. But this one is just, like, kind of the generic marmoset, and it can be up to 20 centimeters long. they just kind of roam around Brazil the way that squirrels roam around here. They're a type of monkey, but they're New World monkeys. They're a bit genetically simple compared to most monkeys. Like, they're not super primitive. That's the word I was looking for. They're not super advanced. They don't have wisdom teeth. They don't even have, like, their fingers aren't really fingers. They're more just like claws. They're a bit simple, genetically. They can be kept as pets, but it's not encouraged because they need a bit of variety in their diet and habitat to thrive. They live in families of 3 to 15, and they like to eat insects, fruit, leaves, and they're really known to love gum out of trees. So, like, they're not chewing gum off the street, but they kind of, like, pick apart the bark and take gum out, and they chew on it.
What color are they?
Brown.
Okay.
So, thanks, Marmoset, for coming on the show.
I feel like they'd be weirdly vicious.
They'd probably hurt.
Yeah.
As I said, they just kind of have claws. They probably wouldn't like humans very much.
Anyway, the next question, or the next task, I suppose, something of a continuation of the last one, is to invent a new thing. Something easy. We do this every week on Solacene. I feel like we struggle sometimes, but I had 3 options this time. I started out with something very frivolous because we always kind of, when we're coming up with questions, we're like, let's do something silly. Mm-hmm. But then you were kind of hyping up your own choice, and you're like, I'm really excited for what I invented, and it's so good. And I was like, okay, maybe I shouldn't just choose the Mushroom Kingdom, which is what I had written down. And I didn't really write much except breeding mushrooms for the sewers / subterranean living spaces, ? Just let your imagination run with it. Mushroom Kingdom, Mario. I feel like, because mushrooms are one of the things that you never see those around cities.
You don't.
Unless you're in someone's really gross closet and they're growing out of there. But I don't really know how it would work logistically, what they would feed off down there. Maybe like dead rats or the leaves.
There are a couple mushroom factories in Montreal.
Mushroom factories?
Yeah.
So I didn't know about this at all.
So, I mean, they just grow mushrooms, mainly lion's mane.
They're indoor.
Yeah.
Factories.
Yeah.
Not farms. Hard to say with fungi.
Yeah, exactly.
For eating.
For eating, yeah.
I wasn't thinking about for eating.
So you're just thinking about for decomposition and biodiversity?
No, I wasn't thinking at all.
Just cool.
Yeah, I just came up with the term Mushroom Kingdom, then I tried to
create it.
Yeah.
I can see it. I think it would be interesting.
The other one I was thinking, not an invention, but a cool example of umbrella theory. I'm trying to make that a thing on Solacene.
Yeah.
As in, something is kind of aesthetically cool because it is necessary. Like someone having dirt on their face. It's like, that's cool because that means they must have been doing some hard work or something. It's like the Viking rooftops. You know what I'm talking about? Those huts that had the green, the grass on top.
Okay.
It's a sod roof or a turf roof.
Think bring those back?
No, I don't think bring those back. I just think they're a neat example of umbrella theory in planning. As in, they had to do this because that's what was nearby and that was their means. And so it kind of looks cool. Yeah. I actually think the opposite of bringing it back. Because if people started doing that just because it's like trendy, that's the opposite of umbrella theory.
I see. I low-key feel that with all the lead buildings I've ever seen. It's like, these in theory are cool. It's like, okay, there's a green roof. There's like water running through the walls to heat the building. It's like, there's so many different things that these buildings have. But it's like, because they're just like intentionally cool, it makes them almost uncool. Yeah,
but also a lot, I mean, it depends on the building.
Yeah.
Because some of them are just functional and that's cool. But some of them, you're right, they feel more like a museum and that's not so cool.
Yeah.
And then the one that I was actually excited about, because I invented it once you said yours was so cool, is, I guess I'll call it nature clouds or nature smell clouds. And what this means is it's like a huge air freshener for the city. Because this is another big difference between the city and living in a rural area, is that the only thing we really smell is cars. Obviously, in the Solacene, very few cars, if any, in the cities. But really what is producing the smell, it's still just kind of the stench of humanity. Maybe that's my misanthropy coming through. But in terms of like, in terms of nature smells in a city, what I'm saying is you don't get very much.
Exactly.
Because of the industry and even in the Solacene, just because of all the BO. But so all we really get is like the smell of rain. You can sometimes pick that up in a city, which is
snow yesterday.
Yeah, I don't buy that. Which is like, rain smells nice, But I think, what if people want that smell of freshly mown grass? Or what else? Like farm smell.
Decomposing leaves?
If there's no mushroom kingdom, like all these different smells of nature, sea spray. So, and I think this could also be democratically chosen, probably each week, maybe each month, definitely not each day. That would be like a weather forecast, and that's too like rapid a change.
Smell forecast.
Yeah, smell forecast. But I'm sure we have the technology for this.
Bundle up, it's going to be buttered popcorn today.
No, not like buttered popcorn, like nature things.
I see.
I'm talking, as I was saying, ways of making the urban environment feel more naturey, even if they're not necessarily. Yeah. Even though they will be necessarily.
Smells, yeah. Or perhaps just designing so that like the flower boxes along the streets have lavender or sage or something that's very fragrant. The
olive trees. Yeah. We're going to pump that into the air.
I don't know how I feel about this pumping.
What?
I feel like we have very different views of this.
Why? It would be safe for the environment.
I guess
you think it would make another hole in the ozone?
I think, or in our lungs.
Right. Have you seen The Amazing Spider-Man 1?
Yes.
You know the antagonist from that film. What was his name?
The lizard?
The lizard. You know, remember his scheme?
To pump the lizard juice into the air and make everyone into lizards?
Yeah, I want to do something like that, but good.
But what if it was co-opted for evil? Someone pumped a bunch of like cat hair and then everyone who's allergic to cats. We'll iron out the details.
Someone really evil makes like a smell of burnt toast.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, oh no, burnt toast.
Yeah. Okay, I see where you're going with this.
There's potential there. Even if you think it's a little bit too fanciful now, that's an idea.
Yeah, it's an idea.
Just a giant, like those things they put on the front of cars, the Christmas trees. Christmas tree smell.
Yeah. We
used to live around Christmas tree farms, and it was a wonderful smell every December. And I think cities deserve that.
So my question answers all kind of merged together a bit. And I think that's maybe why I was speaking like it was so obvious, because my invention and also my urban planning theory that I'll talk about later all kind of go together. So my invention does kind of already exist, but not really. Like it kind of exists as like a cool architectural element. It's not widely spread.
So already it's points for me because I actually was thinking outside the box.
So mine are nature highways. They have 5 benefits. 1, verticality, because we like things being up and down.
Yeah, we do.
So verticality. 2, repurposing old infrastructure. So perhaps because there aren't cars, all these highways and different like parking garages, we could just tear them down, or perhaps we could turn them into these vertical nature highways, as I'm saying. And then the biggest benefit is biodiversity, because in these areas, people wouldn't be using them every day. Perhaps they could be used, this is one of my other benefits, as a means of like, okay, I'm going to go to work. I'm going to take the nature highway instead of biking on the street or taking the bus or the metro. Like you could just walk through the nature highway, but I think it would have to be walking only. And it would just be nice. Walk through nature to get to work.
Just describe to me what is the nature highway.
So you know a highway, how they're like up?
Oh, an overpass.
Yeah, overpasses.
Okay.
So turning those...
So they are raised on columns in the ground.
Yeah.
Let's say. Okay.
And then underneath could be where we bike, and therefore it's shaded.
Or like things. A monorail, which is an elevated inner city rail. Okay, yeah. I got you.
Something like that with nature. And it could also help habitat fragmentation. So perhaps within the city we have 3 big nature reserves, which are completely wild. You're allowed to kind of go in them using the national park scheme that we talked about a few weeks ago. So you have to have training to in them, and they're not open all the time. But anyway, there's these. But maybe the animals live in them naturally migrate.
Oh, so there's paths. It's like arteries between them.
Yeah.
I see.
There are things in Canada from moose to do that, to cross highways.
Moose
crossings. And yeah, they just go over, and they're kind of contained within like fences so that the moose don't walk onto the highway. It's kind of like that for the animals to migrate. And then, yeah, promoting biodiversity, mainly in aviatory, is that a word? Species?
Yes. So
that they can still exist in the city, but they can go there and not have their circadian rhythms or their auditory cues interrupted, because it'll be a bit more natural.
So when you say there's nature on these highways,
yeah,
obviously it will vary based on the location of the city, the climate. sometimes rainforest, sometimes boreal forest or something. But what's an example? Like, what would be on this?
There would be trees.
So it's a strip of concrete, let's say?
I suppose underneath.
Okay, yeah.
And then you would just kind of, I see it as, okay, we put a bunch of soil there.
Yes.
We introduce as many species as is biologically authentic. And then we'd have to help at the beginning.
Yeah, of course.
To kind of get it going, and then I think just kind of leave it.
But is it like a forest, I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Forest is some understory going on. It's like we don't clean up when the leaves fall and if a tree falls, we just leave it. We're not going to like be maintaining it the way that we would a park. And this would encourage, I guess just species to exist without us bothering them. And then if they want to kind of mingle down to the bank or whatever, it's fine. But I don't think they will. They could kind of...
I like the verticality because there's more opportunity for us to do our gliding, which is what I want to introduce. Rock climbing, things like this. Yeah. Web slinging.
I think that there's a good alternative to roads, like because we're going to still have roads in the Solacene because like you need them for bikes and for buses. But it'll be a nice kind of naturally climate controlled way for people to walk if they wanted to, or just to... Maybe you could go camping in these little nature passes. They're not going to be all over. Like there'll be genuine wilderness outside of the cities and in the green belts running between them. But yeah, like it will be inauthentic. It'll be as authentic as possible because it will be pretty much untouched. We don't have to worry about like, well, is there going to be lights and noise and stuff because it'll be elevated and a bit separate.
Nice.
I hope that makes sense.
Maybe the fragrance doesn't even reach them.
Maybe. Yeah, and then this is also slightly inspired by my urban planning theory that I chose to highlight, which is garden cities. I've talked about garden cities. They've been highly inspirational to a lot of the things I've talked about on the podcast because I think they're wonderful. But they have some issues. I think I'd be like a neo-garden cityist because they have a capacity on population, which I think to an extent is cool, but it would take obviously a lot of funding of like so people don't get kicked out. Like, garden cities, basically, there's a central area with about 58,000 people in it, which is like the city. That's where the university would be, the big hospital, the big things. And then once that city reaches capacity, you build so there's a green belt around it, and then you connect one railway to a satellite city, which is the exact same, like there's gardens, there's a hospital and so on, but it's just a little smaller, and that has 32,000 people. And then you keep building these little satellites out, and then it grows to a maximum capacity, 32,000 each satellite.
With wilderness separating them and the rail track coming through.
Yes.
That's my vision.
Yeah, it's my vision too. And I think the population cap is interesting because it's like a lot of the garden cities that have been built, they've been built all over the world to varying degrees of success, of course. They tend to just kind of sprawl and not then as population maybe decreases, just like the last 50 years or so as population in North America has just kind of gone down, like reproduction rates. It's like then they get abandoned, and then you just have a bunch of kind of abandoned developments for the sake of it. So I think trying to have some kind of a limit, or like, oh, the population's going down, maybe we have incentives for people to move here. I don't know exactly how it would work, but I really like the green belts. And of course, the whole idea of there being really centralized, strategic amenities is great, because in a lot of rural or even just like towns in North America, you don't even have basic amenities. It's like you have to drive 3 hours to get to a hospital. And no one wants to go work at the hospitals in these rural areas because they're not great places to live, but these are going to be lovely. A key tenet of them is a big public garden, an arcade called the Crystal Palace, which is covered, but it's also kind of like a greenhouse. So there's like nature inside, but there's also markets and so on. An arcade in like the Roman sense. And yeah, winter gardens. There's about 5,000 buildings, some co-op kitchens, some co-op gardens, and it's all accessible by train. So it's like anyone who lives in the city, you kind of know where they're working, because there'd only be a certain, it's built around a certain industry.
Yes.
It's like kind of why it pops up in the first place. And so it's like you kind of know how everyone works. So like the trains and the buses would be as strategic as possible, because right now it's like, well, I just couldn't get to work on the bus because there's not a bus line that goes there. So you either would have to have a car, you'd have to walk. But here, like, all of that would be orchestrated to a point.
Yeah.
But it's like, obviously, if it's top down, it's going to become a dystopia really quickly. So it has to be quite organic.
Decentralized central cities. Something like on campuses where people will be like, well, I'm an engineering student, so I'm going to live largely in this building with other engineering students near the engineering like campus or the engineering lecturers.
But there's not going to be like, oh, there's no meal hall though for this residence. Like, of course there'll be a meal hall because it's like logical.
Yeah, I mean, people have kitchens.
Yeah, but also like today it's like there's, okay, all these people have built houses around this factory. Like, that's kind of a bad example for the Solacene, but a good example for today. But like, okay, they build rings and rings and rings of houses around this factory. There's no hospital, there's no place to shop, so they still would need cars, even though they all live together and can access their work.
In other words, being a town, being a functional settlement, which we don't really have that much of these days for some reason.
Yeah.
You also just brought to my mind a hot take of something that I think should return in the Solacene: exile. I've been thinking about this recently. Maybe we'll cover it more in our Solacene, in our crime semester, which I suspect we will have, or our prison reform semester. But every time I'm reading about I'm talking about like ancient poets or painters or even medieval, it seems like so many revolutionaries, they just had this period where it was like, well, yeah, then he was exiled from Florence for 25 years. And I just think that's a cool, it's a non-violent punishment. Because it's like, it's kind of a punishment, but also he can still go and explore the world, just not allowed back in Florence.
Yeah.
Unless he sneaks back in.
Ooh.
Yeah. Exile, though. You don't think so?
I'm not on board with exile. Maybe exile for like, okay, kids can't come inside. You have to go wander around the woods for a few hours.
I'm talking about punishment.
Imagine in high school, instead of like detention, you just like gotta go in the woods. You can't come back.
Well, that's what happened to Harry and his friends. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Draco.
Yeah, they learned their lesson. They didn't.
They didn't, yeah. Okay, for my like urban planning theory, I didn't highlight anything for the sake of this is what the Solacene will be, because you already nabbed that one, which is a garden city. So I was looking at other ones and had this quote by Le Corbusier, the French architect, modernist, which was, to create architecture is to put in order. Put what in order? Function and objects.
Yeah.
I just thought that was a neat quote. His ideas on city planning are, to put it lightly, not our ideas on city planning. He had a lot of different kind of drafts and sketches and plans which were never built. But the one city which he did have a big hand in building was in India. It's called Chandigarh, excuse the pronunciation. And it's like, it's cool. They have some nice building. I've never been there, but just from what I can read online, it's like they have some nice buildings, and architecturally it's quite sound. But in terms of the actual planning, it's like there's problems with housing, and there's a bunch of slums built on the outskirts because essentially his like vision was segregating the different functions of society. So it's like in a city, this is like a housing district, this is like an industrial district, this is like an entertainment district. And it's, as you were just saying, that actually doesn't make much sense at all. It was called like the towers in the park theory, where it's like huge skyscrapers. He was around like 100 years ago, so the issue of overpopulation in cities was just kind of coming to the fore. And so I think it was maybe like a radical response to that, where it's a lot of skyscrapers people live in, and they look out on a more wild spot and other amenities and things like this.
I see.
He was also very, very into geometry. He hated winding roads. There was this quote of his that was like, winding roads are for donkeys. Straight lines are for like the soul of man, or something like this. And he was like, we need to have 90-degree angles at intersections. He was very, very authoritarian. He, I think, essentially conceived of himself as the philosopher king, planning all the cities. And it was like, felt kind of dirty reading them, but in all his like theses, planning was capitalized P. It was like, the plan is king. And I was like, it sounds like he's insane or something.
It's always a bit nuts when you read city plans. Almost every one that I read, even like the best ones that I love, it's like, this seems, very authoritarian. And
well, that's planning.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying about the old cities. It was wonderful because they were a somewhat natural spawn of, if not the whole populace, at least several different generations of these wannabe philosopher kings. You know, each of them is kind of a voice of the people of the time.
Yeah.
So obviously that's not what we think Solacites will have or what they want, but it just made me think about, what do people want when they're living? Because that's really the answer to this question, in terms of like, well, what kind of nature do people want around them? And I was also thinking about the difference between not just an urban and a rural town or city, but the concept of the home is different when you're in a city versus when you're in a more rural area, because like you spend a different amount of time in each one, depending where you live. And like most often you own one and you rent the other. Like there's just fundamental differences in there that maybe are not so obvious, but they're intuitive because of the way we live. But it's like, we talked about it a little bit moving to Montreal. It's like, well, obviously we'll have less space because it's in a small apartment versus a house, but there's a library nearby, there's a cinema nearby, there's a gym nearby, there's a church nearby. So it's like you kind of externalize those elements of lifestyle. Yeah. And maybe I'm just explaining things very, very simple things to people as if they're complicated, but it just helps me to think about these things. Also, a few weeks ago, I made the proclamation that I not just want to be, but I will one day become a marine biologist. I think I'm also going to become an architect.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Why not?
Those will be my two things.
Okay, cool.
My only two things.
Yeah. I think cities also, in the Solacene, they'll be at once more and less vertical, because right now there's like huge verticality right just in like 1 or 2 blocks where there's all the skyscrapers.
Yes.
And then around it, everything drops to like 3 stories. I think if everything within like a certain area was like 6 stories, it would kind of cut the difference. Because right now it was like when we were in Athens and we went up and looked out at like the whole city. And it was just like, I don't even know how far that was. Probably
very,
hundreds
very
and hundreds of kilometers of just 1-story buildings.
Not about hundreds of kilometers, but yeah,
it was big.
It was very far. We went up on a mountain.
Yeah.
So that's kind of maybe a little bit akin to the next theory I wanted to mention, which is called landscape urbanism. And in China, there's a version of it called negative planning, which is described as largely adhering to feng shui as like the sacred landscape, abiding by the principles of ecology first. And there's this quote, it's like, a city's not a tree, it is a landscape. So you plan around the key ecological infrastructure, the key features.
Yeah, don't fill in mangroves and don't cover up rivers.
Yeah. I mean, it's maybe a little bit too late because most cities are built.
Yeah.
But in terms of like building new cities, that kind of planning, it says green space is like the base of the planning, not street space. So I don't really know how to visualize this, but it's interesting. I just thought it'd be interesting nonetheless to kind of mention that.
Yeah, for sure. I think, well, that's not really nature. I was going to say we talk about retrofitting next week, but maybe we'll save that for the infrastructure and city planning
next
semester.
Week, we should talk about elephants.
Okay.
Poaching.
Hunting. Okay.
And maybe like different materials in the home, in our lives, the mosaic of fabric and building blocks.
Resource extraction.
Yes.
In all its facets. Lovely. Thank you all for listening. And once again, we'd like to thank the Marmoset for coming on the show and sponsoring this week's episode.